Good morning and a massive welcome to the Scottish Storytelling Centre. I'm only standing up because I've got one of those voices that I cannot cut across the crowd. I'm Fiona Ferguson, Creative Development Director with Imaginate, and this morning, despite being on day 7 or something of 6 a.m. rises, I am extremely happy for 3 reasons. First of all, we're here. 31st, I think Noel said, Edinburgh International, 32nd Edinburgh International Children's Festival, and we're here in blinking person. I'm also exceptionally excited because in the room we have around about 22 push artists and partners who also have not yet mostly met each other in person, and they are arrived all day yesterday and spending the next 2 days. So these 2 rows, introduce yourself to them afterwards. And finally, I'm delighted because I get to share a stage with these 3 phenomenal women and artists. So what's going to happen this morning is I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. We'll talk to Shiori about a work in development she's doing, and then there'll be time for questions, and then we'll talk with Ellen and Emily. You can see I've suddenly realised that I was yet again talking too fast. So if I can start with just asking the 3 of you to introduce yourself and what you do.
Okay, so hello everybody. I am Shiori. I am originally from Japan. I am a composer who normally compose music for symphony orchestras, large ensemble, chamber ensemble, and so on. And I am also a music improviser. My main interest or fascination is exploring different kind of sound and timbre. So when I do improvising, I play piano, but also my favorite thing to do is to play inside the piano and play with ping pong balls and bouncy balls.
You didn't mishear that was play inside the piano.
And sometimes under the piano. It's really great, you should try it. And then I also play around with lots of different timbres of my voice. So yeah, that's what I do.
And if any of you have seen Sound Symphony this week and you're thinking, Shiori looks really familiar, that's because Shiori has been performing this week in Sound Symphony. Ellen.
I'm Ellen. I am a poet and theatre maker from Edinburgh. And I suppose a lot of what I do is around putting poetry alongside other forms and seeing where it fits in with other things.
Thank you, Ellen. And Emily?
Hello, I'm Emily. I'm also from Edinburgh. I'm a circus artist, sometimes producer, sometimes photographer, sort of a bit of lots of different things.
And if any of you were here at the Family Encounters Day on Saturday the 7th, which feels like about 5 months ago now, Ellen and Emily were premiering their new show for visually impaired children called How to Photograph a Dinosaur, that we will come back to in the second half. Now, the first thing I'm going to say about Shiori is something that we can only talk about in this room, because it hasn't yet been announced that Shiori is going to work with us as accelerator artist to take this idea further into a work in progress stage alongside Salman Lewis, who some of you will have heard from on Monday. So can you start, Shiori, by telling us a little bit about the idea that you came to us with, which we're calling Immersing in Tactile Sound. So it's a working title.
Yeah. So I have started this project with 2 musicians, Dave, the sound designer, and John, the trombone player. And we are working with disabled young people in a school in Dundee, and we work in hydrotherapy pool in the school. And my main interests, things that I wanted to explore in this project was finding different sound world that I'd like to immerse in, or finding different kind of sound stimuli through the medium of water, and
underwater
underwater sound.
We actually have some interviews with the two musicians, so we might play that now to give you an idea of what Dave was doing above and what Joff was doing in. I have never yet seen a rehearsal process in which the entire team are pretty much in swimming costumes in the pool. You will see a little bit of that footage later, but could we first play Dave and John?
My name's Dave House. I'm a musician and sound artist, and my role in the project was as a sound designer. So I was recording various sound sources and manipulating those in the laptop. So the laptop was my main tool, but I also had speakers and microphones and controllers in which to manipulate and distribute that sound. So one of my main challenges was technical in nature. So there were many destinations that we needed to get sound to, so floating speakers and an underwater speaker. So we had to think about how we were going to do that. So, we didn't want cables lying everywhere on the poolside and potentially getting in the way of staff and students. So we had to think about wireless methods. Sourcing the underwater speaker was a challenge, and then working out the best way to use that, especially when we didn't have access to the pool. So by its nature, it's designed to be used underwater. That's its natural habitat. So using it out of the water, it didn't work as it should. So that was another technical challenge. So from a sound design perspective, I thought with the way we were able to use the space and the environment was great. We had sound. It was very 3D and very immersive. So we had sound sources floating around. We had sound source under the water, and so it was very kind of spatial in that sense. And some of the young people reacted quite strongly to those sound sources. So looking towards and moving towards various sounds, especially the more unexpected ones. Other students we work with weren't quite so stimulated by the sounds in and of themselves, and were more interested in the interaction they could have with the objects. And from my perspective, they were more interested in the physical items like acoustic instruments and stuff, rather than speakers and the more technical things that I'd been working with. So that was interesting from my perspective. So for the future of the work, I'm excited to work with more students and some of the same people we worked with before, and just trying out different ways of distributing the audio in the space, whether it's playing the instruments or playing it through the computer, different ways to try and engage with the students more effectively.
Hi there, I'm John Kenny, speaking to you from my study here in Edinburgh. Sometimes I get called Professor John Kenny, but I try to avoid that as much as possible. So I was involved in this project playing the trombone, but not a conventional metal shiny trombone. In fact, a plastic trombone. We call them P-bones, the same size as a trombone, but in lovely red plastic, and also a thing called a P-buzz, which is a little bit like one of those instruments you see in South American football matches. Venezuela is just a tube but this one you can extend like a big swanny whistle, and it has a trombone mouthpiece on it. So they're both made of plastic, and therefore they're impervious to water. And I was, in addition to that, playing a few little bells and so on, and one of these, in fact, this very one that I'm holding, which is a queen conch, very beautiful instrument, and I was playing that in the water, both with my lips and also pouring water in and out of it. This was an absolutely wonderful project. To say that it was immersive all sounds rather funny, since we were literally getting into water. So it was a real immersion project. It was wonderful to see the way that these children responded simply to the sheer physical joy of being in the water. And we always took a little while to get to know them in the water without sound. We sang to them when they first got in there, and then it was just about enjoying the warmth and the floating and so on. And gradually we introduced more and more sound, and it was fascinating to see the way that they, just like we, were experiencing that sound in their bodies, various parts of their bodies. For some, the feeling was more in the feet or the extremities, the fingers, and they would reach towards a sound source. For others, it was around the head, and we actually did quite a lot of experimenting where I, for instance, would literally play all around the body of a floating person, or even play on the tummy of a floating person, or on the forehead of a floating person. It was a lot of fun. It was quite clearly quite a lot of fun for the people getting treated in that way. It was a thoroughly positive experience for all of us. It seems to me that this entire project shows us a great deal of potential for further experimenting, further activity, because we can analyse and observe what was taking place on a lot of different levels, on the intellectual level, on the emotional level, on the physical level, and on the level of thinking about our abilities to perceive sound emotionally through a different medium.
Thank you, Dave and John. We really wanted to find a way to include them today. John is actually, I would say, a world famous Carnix player. This is a very niche thing, but if you want to know more about Carnix, I can talk about Carnix for a long time. A very old medieval instrument with a big tongue. You worked in part of the development. You worked with Kings Park School in Dundee, and I wondered if you could tell everyone a little bit about those sessions.
Yeah, so we planned to have 3 sessions at school, and we managed to only do one because I got COVID after the first session. But basically we had 2 groups of young people who worked with us, and we had basically 3 different immersive sound environment that we wanted to explore together. So the first day we worked together with the sound inspired by the sea and its creatures. And one of the reasons why I wanted to explore that was that the instrument range of tenor trombone is exactly those range that are used by whales in the sea when they do the whale song. And so I thought it was really brilliant to have that instruments actually like moving around the hydro pool and playing some of the fragments of whale song. And we also had floating speakers, as Dave mentioned, and underwater speaker, which played some other sea creatures sound.
I imagine the vibrations was quite strong underwater with all the speakers, because it's quite a small pool.
Yeah. So everybody reacted in a different ways, of course. But yeah, one of the girls we worked with was really responsive to the vibration coming from Anna's water. Yeah, she was just smiling a lot, and yeah, that's great.
I think now would be a good time to watch the second bit of footage that we have, which is some of the rehearsal footage. So I think Cedric, who's been filming the entire festival, came up and we got some rehearsal footage that we've edited a couple of minutes for you.
Oh, yeah. She might just go forward or something I can do.
Yeah.
I think that gives you a really good idea of what they've been playing with so far. Were there things that you saw in responses from the children that you weren't expecting, or things that you've learned from for the next
Yeah, a lot
phase?
of things.
Yeah.
So that girl we just saw was not so much in tune with sound, but she was more fascinated with movements and visuals. So when John combined that, all of this together, sound, visual, also conch and movement, it slowly comes rising up and stuff. Yeah, it worked better. Some of the kids really like, was exploring and the sound, different kind of sound, but especially responded well with strange sound, like not like musical, normal kind of melody or something, but responded more to what we normally called noise, because maybe it was more unusual for her, or so they grabbed their attention and really loved being immersed in that, I find. Yeah. Some of them had also like, some of them had to be hoisted into the pool because their movement were restricted. So yeah, we kind of needed to think how to include this time of the young people actually getting into the pool and then actually being in the swimming pool enjoying the experience, because this is also a part of the journey that they take. So yeah, it's interesting.
And plans going forward is to go back to Kings Park School because they've been brilliant to work with, and the feedback from them, one of the people in the pool was the PE teacher who was just delighted. But I think there's also other layers that you want to play with. You can maybe talk about that with light and projection.
Oh yeah. So we still need to complete 2 other days at school, and we would like to explore things like the sound in space, sound of us actually in the womb, like mother's womb, and we would like to explore playing sound of heartbeats through underwater speakers and things like that. And then after
and that's in June?
That's in June, yeah. And after that, it's still very much kind of in my head, but I'd like to explore with the projection of the images through water, and maybe with synchronized swimmer. Possibilities are endless.
Yeah, amazing. And as part of Accelerator, hopefully along with Liz and Sam coming to Tweetact Festival, I've got to spell that one out, I was just thinking for Nicholl, in Utrecht in the first weekend of July, so we might see some of you there. Do people in the audience have questions for Shiori? No, Jordan. Straight up.
Sorry, I'm fascinated by the hydro pool, and I know that there's been some work done in Northern Ireland with this site-specific nature. And excuse me, I know nothing about Scotland and the lay of the land. Like, there are hydro pools kind of throughout special schools around Scotland, or how do you imagine a kind of a work like this touring? And I can't wait.
That was like research question number 1.
Sure.
Because I have to say, I was thinking this morning that we first saw Shiori, I think Pam and I went to see Sound Symphony. We were like, ooh, who is this performer? Because as a musician, I've seen a lot of musicians being cast into theatre performances, and apart from a few exceptions who are mostly in this room, it's often a little bit, it doesn't come so naturally, and you have this incredible performative character that goes alongside. And then, I can't even remember how we started talking about, I think we had a Zoom call and started talking about this idea. So one of the first questions was, does every school have a hydrotherapy pool? Which mostly they do. But that would be a very specific, we're looking for schools who have, but there are a lot of artists and workshops that happen in hydrotherapy schools already, just maybe less performances. I kind of answered that for you, sorry. Brilliant.
So like the hydrotherapy pool I see in Ireland are like normal size pools compared compared to that small hydrotherapy people. So like what how would you have to kind of make if you went to normal sized school, would you have to make it into how you would rig out a stage for this for your set, or would you use a whole space?
Sounds like a
Who I
big
work
picture
with, I think,
question.
yeah. If I work with synchronized swimmer, maybe we need a whole school. But that's something we need to figure out still, I think. Yeah, it was interesting because the hydro pool that we worked at school, this school, was really small, but it had a specific temperature, and some of the students we worked with couldn't be in other hydrotherapy pools that they also had, which was much bigger than the one that we worked. So yeah, there is also this element to think about.
It's that kind of research that we hope Accelerator offers, because we haven't been able to get into schools. When you went into Kings Park, that was the first time we were able to actually go into a school for quite a long time. So there's definitely a lot of research to do, and we know from other schools touring with theatre in schools that every setup is completely different, so that's a big factor. I think you had a question.
Yes, I'm curious about the children and how they responded to the sounds, but also if they kind of interacted with a shell, for example, or being together with a shell and the sound, and what they it's a question of what they wanted to do and what you invited them to do.
Yeah, so I think we are hoping to explore a different type of interactions in when we actually can get back to school more. But so we had 3 students. One boy got really sleepy, waiting for him to be actually hoisted into the swimming pool. So when actually he was in the pool, he was really he closed his eyes and he wanted to be led, I think, by the support teacher. That girl, autistic young person that we just watched, she was very much into playing, jumping about, so I also tried to jump when I played the instrument, just to be to enjoy the space together, and we did offer her to play an instrument, but some things she wanted to try, some things she didn't. So there is
We've got time for one more, and then we'll move on to the next project, but hopefully we'll have time at the end to come back. Saskia?
Just a very short comment. We were talking about it yesterday in the talk, that it would be so nice to have performances which are made for different audience groups, like Barrel and Ballet started with a performance for the regular audiences with Tiger, and then made it to Playful Tiger and Tiger Tail. And I would really love to be in that swimming pool. So I wonder if you could make one with synchron dancer or swimmers around. Yes, it would be.
Series of 3. We'll come back if there's time at the end for more questions, and also you'll be able to catch some of us upstairs before we head off. Thank you, Shiori. And also thank you to Jess, who I see at the back from Dundee Rep, who made that relationship for us with the school, which really makes a massive difference. Emily and Ellen, first question for you is, how did you meet? How did this duo come about?
We were both participants on a kind of online residency called Field, by to destination language in around this time last year, I think April last year.
Was that only this time last year?
And there were a lot of people taking part, but I remember it's funny doing those things online, but I remember being like, me and her keep agreeing whenever we spoke. And so it was kind of from there. And then we had some conversations as part of Emily's Jerwood project with Imagining. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean also before Field I followed Ellen's work and poetry for a while. I didn't really understand poetry that much till really recently, and I think Ellen's work's one of the ones I really connected with. And so at Field I was really excited to meet you. And yeah, we had a great conversation on Zoom to do with sensory experiences in the outdoors or the fellowship, and then we talked a lot about photography somehow and different practices, and so when we had just really great conversations, but we hadn't met until we were working on this show together.
Wow. It's probably worth saying that Jerwood Fellows is one of the year-round projects that we do. In year one, Emily and Claire Willoughby, who you probably have seen or will see in Whirligig, were selected as two Jerwood Fellows, working with Imaginate and placement with Oily Cart to explore work for disabled children and young people. And then another hot secret straight off the is that we did a second call out for deaf or disabled artists in Scotland to apply to explore work for children. And Ellen is going to be one of the new Jerwood artists, also not yet been announced. So when we then got an application to do one of the family encounter commissions from You Together, it's just like the full circle. So yeah. How did the idea for how do you take a photograph of a dinosaur come about?
When we had this first conversation, it was really great for me on the phone, and I do a lot of photography, and we were talking about what that means for me, and it sort of is something about noticing. And I use the lens, and I'm sighted, so there's very visual focus, but it also allows me to notice other senses or situations or atmospheres or sounds and sensations that I'm in. And I guess we talked about why do we take photographs, and often it's not for the image, but it's for a sense of a story of a place or a situation. And I've been trying to learn to describe my photographs with a sort of alt text, and trying to do that in a more poetic way or interesting way than just learning about what audio description is useful. Mm-hmm. And so we had a conversation about that, and it ended up somehow that we talked about dinosaurs being things that no one has ever seen, so it would be impossible to take a photograph of one. And there's something nice in our conversation. We wanted to work in a way which dismantled the hierarchy of the senses, which places sight at the top often. And so maybe it's interesting to think about how would you take a photo of something that we can't see, but yet remains super vivid in our imagination because of the science and the research around it. But it's never, and the sort of link between modern day birds, that their ancestors are dinosaurs, so we can kind of see them, but not really. So there's something. Yeah, do you want to add anything? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, I think all of that, and the idea that for me, I'd been taking a lot of photographs around the time, and would have get kind of caught up in this cycle in my head of who's. I realised I wasn't trying to recreate how I had experienced the image. I had an idea of how other people might see it and what a good photograph would be. So that fed into our conversation about that a lot. And this idea of when alt text is really good, because I've got a bit of vision, if I read the alt text, I know what the picture's going to look like before I then look at it. So that idea of how you can use everything else around you to then eventually see an image without using your eyes at all.
You, it was a really magical experience on Saturday because I don't know how many of you have been to the National Museum of Scotland on Family Encounters Day, but it's a very loud, noisy, fun, crazy atmosphere. So to end my day in your piece was really beautiful. Particularly because you were using so many different art forms and senses. Can you talk a wee bit about how you approached the choreographic process while also thinking about a visually impaired audience?
I would just say, I know Emily has more to say about this than me, but in terms of all the different senses that are different inputs, that felt quite important to me in terms of access. And I think the experience on Saturday really reinforced that for me, the importance of rather than thinking so specifically and more likely getting it wrong, trying to imagine what an audience will need, or try and second guess them, or try and stick different things on at the end that will be helpful, to just give a lot of options and not so many that it's overwhelming, but so that they can tune in or out of whatever they want. If something doesn't work, if the sound doesn't appeal to them, then maybe the sense of touch will. And I think that's relevant for everyone who came into the room, not just the blind or visually impaired children.
Yeah, I guess we wanted to choreograph or design the show from how things felt or sounded like, or rather than what they looked like. So as a circus artist, that's such a visual art form, it was really challenging. I kept wanting to add things that were super visual. Like, no. I mean, so it was really great process of like dismantling your own sort of biases, or recognizing them anyway, and then that it's interesting to work together in that way as a sighted and as a visually impaired person. And then we also made the decision to not need any audio description. So we did have something at the beginning which sort of described what might be in the room that the audience listened to in headphones to prepare them, to help them to feel safe a little bit. And then, but we didn't want something that would happen if I did a cartwheel or something, and then which would maybe make the parent want to explain to the child, oh, you've missed something here. So yeah, so that informed the choreography, as well as we had a lot of moving speakers, and so I would move them around and manipulate things, and I felt a bit like a puppeteer in the end of. So there was a bird playing out of a speaker that we could put up and down and around, so that informed my choreography through what the speaker needed to do, rather than what I was doing. Or I would play cello when I needed it to be in one place, and the children would follow it. And if I moved around too much, that would be confusing as to where, because it was a promenade performance, so they moved. So Alan was saying, you need to stay still and do movement, but statically. I can't, if you want to follow the sound, if I'm just going randomly. So there's things like that I think are interesting to explore in the future. I think we managed to touch on a few things, but there's a lot more to try.
You did manage to do some workshops with visually impaired children before you landed in the museum. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, as well we had some COVID complications. A lot of COVID complications during our rehearsal time. So the National Museum have a visually impaired families group that they work with throughout the year, who were hoping to come and see an early performance of the show at that point, but as we hadn't been managed to be in a room together yet, that didn't really happen. But I had a really lovely afternoon with them. We did a kind of writing workshop based around the show, which I suppose the premise of which was about dinosaurs and poems being quite similar in that they're quite intimidating. And got like a fixed idea of what they are because someone, a man a long time ago told us what they are. Actually, if we interrogate that, they're not, and we can have fun with them, and they're come in all different shapes and things. So we made a kind of a layered poem together. So one of them was doing a kind of bass line using words to make like dinosaur footsteps, and then we made a story about a yellow dinosaur that lived in the desert and ate bananas, and we made all these different sounds and kind of built up this story together. And it felt quite important for me in terms of making the piece because it was quite a simple workshop, and we just spoke to each other. And I think it's quite easy to get carried away and think about, like overthink, and bring in all these fancy things and technologies that we think will be good for visually impaired people, but actually we did that all just through talking, and that was engaging enough for them. And we kind of did it in a way that would work for everyone in the room, but it also didn't feel like a specially made thing for them. And so that definitely factored into what we did later on.
I should have thought to ask you to bring some of the text because it's really beautiful poetry, so maybe we can somehow share that. I'm really aware of time and wanting to give space for people to ask questions, but I would love to ask you first. Because I only saw, I think it was the final performance, about the responses that you had from children and families on Saturday.
It was really mixed audiences each. We did 9 times. It was about 10-15 minutes, and I think over the day we had maybe 5 or 6 visually impaired or blind children in different groups of, sometimes alone, sometimes with other sighted children, there was one performance which was just for a blind girl and her mum, and her dad sat at the side in the morning. And I think that, for me anyway, I mean they were all great, but to really be able to respond to her and what she was engaging with, and take time a bit longer, and for her to have the freedom for that without the pressure of anyone else in the room, even watching her in a way, maybe, was just really beautiful. And so there was a cello in the show, and she really spent time with it a lot more than in the other performances. And she said at the end that she couldn't see a dinosaur, but she could feel its heartbeat. And that just felt really magical. I hadn't thought of it as the heartbeat. So, and there were other times the boy was also really it was just really nice to hear the reactions that were all different because of the blind and visually impaired experience is obviously very varied. So sometimes they would see things suddenly, as when they moved towards the trees, he was like, oh, there's some bushes in this room. Whereas when sighted children would enter the room, it was obvious, they can see that. But they only realised that was there when they were closer to it. So things like that, I think, were surprising and things to learn. Do you have anything to add?
I don't think so.
Do you have any questions for Ellen and Emily? I can ask you one more of my questions then, which is just what you're thinking about next. Because in both projects, the pandemic had quite an impact. So yeah, thinking about what you might want to do next.
I think just to have a bit more time in a room together would be nice. There are definitely things that emerged from the performances that feel interesting, feel like that's the direction things should go in. I think also to spend more time with blind and visually impaired children, and speaking to them more about what they get from the experience and what they would rather have feels quite important in terms of what's next.
Yeah, we had begun a relationship with the Royal Blind School in Edinburgh, but again, as soon as you set things up, then things change, and then we can't come into the school. So, but that relationship is there to be picked up on. I also wondered, Ellen, if you would be up for telling us a wee bit about the idea that you have for the Gerwood Fellowship, to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I suppose it leads on from this a wee bit. I'm interested in, it's quite vague just now, but I'm interested in making something where we just don't need our eyes at all to engage with it, and because as Emily spoke about with this hierarchy of the senses, that is a kind of social construct. It hasn't always been this way, that we're so reliant on primarily our sight and our sound. That's quite a recent development in the West. So I think trying to, we default to our eyes all the time. Even as someone with not much sight, it feels like the social thing to do. You have to do that. And so I'm interested in creating an environment where blind and visually impaired audiences don't feel like they have to do that, but also they can still experience something live, because a lot of the alternatives that we're presented with are not live. So trying to make some kind of a play, I think, that is live and experienced live, but our eyes aren't needed at all.
Watch this space. Oh, Izzy has a question.
I was just interested to know if there was anything about the reactions of the young people that surprised you, both the blind and the sighted audience.
I think similar, it surprised me, I hadn't considered that someone might not notice what was in the room until they were closer to it, which seems super obvious. I think it was surprising to be able to spend time with the one when it was just a blind girl on her own with her mum. I guess sometimes I was, worried, is this going to work? It was the first time we tried anything. We had after 5 days-ish working together, in the room together anyway, and so it was surprising in a way that she seemed to really engage with the story and a bit of magic, and that felt really nice, and also just learning process when there was sighted children there that it didn't work so well for them, I think, and I think that's also okay, and it's challenging, but they were still engaged, but it's also kind of wasn't for them, and it's kind of surprising maybe to realize, for me anyway, actually it was really fun to really dig into what the experience for the blind and visually impaired children is, and whether or not, I guess similar to what you were just talking about, whether we design something where the aesthetic or what things look like, because everything looks like something, obviously, unless it's invisible, so can we make it that doesn't matter what it looks like, or will it look weird, or is there an aesthetic? Should it be super dark? Should we have made it darker? I think those are really interesting conversations to have, and afterwards I was like, maybe we should have had it in a dark room, and there's different ideas, but I think that surprised me or challenging me to be like, what it looks like is not important, but I always want it to look beautiful, but then it's also not about that. So it's surprising that children, we went into a cave at one point and some children were really scared and all we did was make the sound different. But it still creates something, so that's nice to explore. Don't know if that's a rambling answer.
I'll say one other thing about that, I suppose it wasn't necessarily surprising, but it was really interesting, was to watch, because we gave the option for parents to sit at the side, and to watch, I found really beautiful, particularly the relationships between siblings. And I think as a visually impaired person, in my experience, you're often led about or following a parent, especially as a child. So I think having something that they could both engage with together and to think about that shared experience now feels quite important and something to think about more that hadn't necessarily been considered beforehand.
Yeah, I had it's more of a comment / question than a question I have on both of you. And it's mostly on the collaboration and how I think you said it, Emily, how you somehow become aware of what your art form is somehow has been until now, and how a collaboration between differently abled artists can allow you to perspectivize your art form and really make changes in this project, but also further on. So if I should formulate a question, would it be then, what, like, through this collaboration, can you take some things out of it which will be part of your artistic practice further on? As for example, in the project that you mentioned, Ellen, now going into a project on your own and not in collaboration, like, did you experience things that developed your artistic practice in a direction that it wouldn't have done it if you chose to collaborate with similarly able artists, for example?
Yeah, absolutely, and I feel like that feels very equal for me, and felt like a very equal collaboration, and I learned an immense amount from working with Emily, and still am. In terms of the relationship with movement and text, and also the breadth of what movement can be, and there were things like Emily, if I was moving things about, I'd just move them about, and Emily's like doing this really beautiful stuff around the room and making everything important. And making sure that everything that happens in the room is there for a reason is something Emily's really good at. And that's not really in my practice that much. And so that's definitely something that sticks with me a lot from watching you operate in the room and perform, that the whole thing is part of the performance and everything can be made into something beautiful.
Yeah, and the same that working with Ellen, I'd never worked with a writer or poet before, and I think, we'd make something and then Ellen would write this beautiful, really sensory, in a way, text that just added so much texture, and I hadn't fully appreciated perhaps how much the words, or maybe it's your poetry in particular, I find adds texture and sensory aspect and description and atmosphere to what's happening, and I'm not a word person at all, so that was really interesting to see how those things merge, and also just challenging yourself. What does circus, as a circus artist, what does circus mean? There's not actually any circus in that show. Could there be in the future, and what makes a circus show circus if it hasn't got a trick in it, because you can't see the handstand? So we're also talking about what does circus sound like, or what does a handstand sound like, what does a hand-to-hand sound like. So these things definitely will come into practice, and generally being aware of the that I'm a visual person and how to notice other things. Noticing, I think they're really good at also noticing. That's been really nice. It was really calm, despite all the COVID process. It's a very lovely, calm person to work with, and I'm a lot more. Yeah, great. Really learning a lot.
It's something we've been talking about a lot, actually, is just the joy of being able to find a collaborator who you want to work with, and how a lot of the graduates and people who have graduated in the last 3 years and then sat in living rooms for a long time haven't actually been able to find the right collaborator, and we have now a little more, I would say, duos applying for some of our, like Lewis and Sam, we have Leslie and Claire doing Launchpad, of people who have actually found someone who they're excited to make work with, which is such a nice thing. Unfortunately, we have run out of time to continue, but we will slowly make our way up, so if you want to ask any questions of the panel, I'm sure they'd be happy to talk with you. Tomorrow we have the last delegate talk, which will be connected with the PUSH programme, and we have Emily Conway, who's sitting in front of me here, and Aideen Howard, who is further up the back, and Robert Softly-Gale of Birds of Paradise Theatre, and the three of them will join me tomorrow, specifically to talk about the barrier for disabled artists to work professionally in the young audiences sector, specifically thinking about the benefits difficulty with earning professionally, but also what I think will be interesting to share is what's happening in Ireland just now with universal basic income, and some of the really basic thoughts that haven't happened in order for that to be accessible for disabled artists to actually be part of that pilot. So, it was a very long-winded way to say, come and join us tomorrow at 11? Yeah? 12? 12. Yes. 12, I think, here tomorrow. And all that's left to say is a massive thank you to Izzy and Hannah for supporting the event, for Cedric for doing 5 million bits of filming for all of our delegate, to our incredible panel, including Nicholl doing the signing, and to all of you for joining us. Have a very nice day at the festival.